In our readings and film clips, we'll get an idea of how immigrants are currently living under the cloud of United States immigration law. Here, I'd like to give you a brief overview of some major moments in U.S. immigration policy since the early 1950s. I've adapted this presentation from the Council on Foreign Relations, a nonpartisan think tank that publishes the journal Foreign Affairs. As the Cold War deepens, the U.S. government consolidates its immigration and naturalization laws. The McCarran-Walter Act ends late 19th century policies designed to exclude Asian immigrants, but upholds the ethnically based quota system that favored white European immigrants, revising limitations to add 1/6 of 1% of each group already in the United States. President Harry Truman vetoes the bill, citing discrimination against Asian immigrants. Congress overrides him to pass the bill. The post-war period causes a swell of illegal immigration to the United States from Mexico, with an estimated 3 million undocumented Mexicans in the country, working mostly in agricultural jobs at significantly lower wages than American workers receive. Under growing pressure to act, the Immigration and Naturalization Service under President Eisenhower enacts a sweep of undocumented Mexican immigrants in the southwestern United States. The sweep, officially termed Operation Wetback, authorizes 1,075 Border Patrol agents, along with local law enforcement, to target barrios in California, Arizona, and Texas. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his guerrilla forces overthrow the government of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba and set up a new communist order, resulting in a mass exodus of Cubans to the United States. The first wave includes political supporters of Batista as well as members of Cuba's elite and middle class, who largely settle in Florida's Miami or Dade County. In 1966, the U.S. enacts the Cuban Adjustment Act to allow permanent resident status to Cuban refugees who arrive after 1959. About 1 million Cubans emigrate to the United States between 1959 and 1990. In 1964, amid mounting pressure, the U.S. government lets its Mexican guest worker program expire. The bracero program, instituted during World War II, gave contracts to Mexican workers to be employed in U.S. agriculture. Over a 22-year period, about 4.5 million contracts were signed for workers to come to the U.S. The program stipulates that braceros are entitled to wages equal to U.S. workers, free housing, affordable meals, and insurance, but these rules are broken by many employers. Many farm workers receive a fraction of the wages of American laborers. Lee G. Williams, the last director of the program, refers to the system as legalized slavery. The end of the bracero program results in an acceleration of illegal immigration across the border. During the Civil Rights Movement, the government shifts federal immigration legislation away from the quota system in 1920 standards deemed by President Lyndon B. Johnson as un-American in the highest sense. The 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act sets up a system of preferences placing emphasis on family reunification. The bill, through the family preference that allows naturalized U.S. citizens to sponsor relatives to immigrate to the country, sets the course for dramatically altering the demographics of the nation. Southeast Asia faced turmoil in the 1970s as the Vietnam War was winding down. The Khmer Rouge seizes control in Cambodia, and Laos falls under the control of the Pathet Lao. After Saigon is captured by the People's Army of Vietnam, the Gerald Ford administration enacts the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act to help 130,000 Southeast Asian refugees. The move receives broad support among civil rights advocates, religious groups, and organized labor. The number of Southeast Asian boat people immigrating to the United States swells by the early 1980s. Congress approves the Immigration Reform and Control Act to address the estimated 3 to 5 million undocumented immigrants in the country. The policy officially mandates employers to affirm the immigration status of their employees and outlaws the practice of knowingly hiring undocumented immigrants, although the administration's enforcement of penalties remains lax. Additionally, the law grants legal status for certain seasonal workers and unauthorized immigrants who arrived in the United States before 1982. This gives these people the opportunity to apply for permanent residence before May 1988, a measure that eventually grants legal status to 3 million people, of which 2.3 million are Mexicans. Illegal immigration continues to flow after the bill's passage. Looking to focus on legal immigration pathways, President George H.W. Bush signs the Immigration Act of 1990, which expands the 1965 Act to allow for an increase in the overall number of immigrant visas granted. Family reunification-based immigration remains a preferential category, but priority is also extended to highly skilled workers and educated workers. The Act creates several types of employment-based visas and temporary visas for college-educated foreigners and sets a cap on the number of unskilled workers entering the country. The law also creates a diversity lottery to distribute visas among those from underrepresented countries. After the legislation is passed, the number of annual immigrant visas granted spikes from 500,000 to 700,000. In 1995, Bill Clinton launches Operation Gatekeeper to slow illegal immigration across the border between San Diego and Tijuana. Clinton doubles the number of Border Patrol agents along the southwestern border and authorizes $50 billion to build a 14-mile security fence, shifting unauthorized crossings eastward toward deserts and mountains. Shortly after its launch, the government declares it a success, but critics denounce it as a militarization of the border, and human rights groups connect it with the deaths of more than 5,000 people who attempt to cross the more treacherous eastern terrain in California and Arizona over the next 15 years. To address the issue of the estimated 2.1 million minors who are brought illegally to the U.S. as children, Congress introduces the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, or DREAM Act, a policy that would carve out a path to citizenship for those young immigrants if they meet certain conditions, including graduating from a U.S. high school or serving 2 years in the military. The Act goes through several revisions and languishes in Congress through the next decade, prompting states to enact their own versions of the DREAM Act to provide in-state tuition for these immigrants. In 2012, President Obama announces a deferred action program that bars this group of immigrants from deportation and pledges to make the DREAM Act a part of comprehensive immigration reform. Following the 9/11-2001 terrorist attacks, Congress passes the Homeland Security Act in 2002, which overhauls the organization of the federal government's immigration functions. This act creates the Department of Homeland Security, which now overtakes all immigration matters. The George W. Bush administration makes border security a top priority, strengthening screening and security measures at airports, allowing agents to more easily detain and deport immigrants with suspected ties to terrorism, and instituting more stringent visa application procedures. The government also enacts a program suspended in 2011 requiring men from predominantly Muslim countries to pre-register and undergo additional screenings while traveling to and from the United States. At the end of George W. Bush's presidency, the administration pilots a program that targets undocumented criminals by allowing local law enforcement to share data with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, or ICE. After President Barack Obama's election in November, Bush expands the program. Secure communities becomes increasingly controversial as critics accuse it of casting too wide a net in apprehending undocumented criminals, deporting large numbers of low-level offenders, and eroding trust in local communities. Frustrated by a perceived lack of federal action to regulate immigration, Arizona Governor Jan Brewer signs a restrictive immigration law that makes it illegal to hire, house, or transport undocumented immigrants. It also permits law enforcement to check the immigration status of people during routine stops, prompting fears from civil rights advocates of increased racial profiling. The law leads to nationwide controversy, and at least 7 other states attempt to push through their own version. The U.S. federal government files a lawsuit against Arizona, citing federal jurisdiction on immigration matters. The case is eventually brought before the United States Supreme Court. The court hands down a mixed ruling in 2012, which upholds the controversial papers pleas provision, but strikes down several of the law's key measures. Under orders from President Obama, the Department of Homeland Security begins delaying deportation and granting work visas to undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children. More than 1 million childhood arrivals are estimated to be eligible for the so-called Deferred Action Program, or DACA. To qualify, an individual must have a clean criminal record, have been in the country for at least 5 years, and be a student, a high school graduate, or a military veteran. Republican governors and legislators widely criticized the move as an abuse of office intended to curry favor with Hispanic voters. President Obama's 2012 presidential re-election, aided by strong support from Hispanic voters, brings a renewed willingness in the Senate to tackle comprehensive immigration reform. In early 2013, a bipartisan group of senators releases a framework to create a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants in the country, streamline legal immigration, enhance border security, and implement employer enforcement. The sweeping overhaul bill passes the Senate but fails to move forward in the Republican-led House. More than 24 states most led by Republican governors, sue the Obama administration for failing to enforce the nation's immigration laws after the president announces his intention to expand DACA and create another program known as DAPA to provide relief to undocumented parents of U.S. citizens and permanent residents. The White House says the programs are similar to those of past administrations and are necessary given congressional gridlock on immigration reform. Roughly 4 million people are estimated to be eligible. In early 2015, a federal judge blocks the program until the case can work its way through the courts. And in June 2016, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court decision by a 4-4 tie. In 2015, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry announces plans to increase the number of refugees admitted into the country annually from 70,000 to 100,000 by 2017. The move comes amid conflict in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, which has sparked the largest global migration crisis since World War II. The White House pledged that among them would be at least 10,000 Syrians fleeing the 4-year civil war, which has displaced more than 11 million people. In January 2017, Donald Trump enters the White House, having promised to enhance border security, especially along the U.S.-Mexico border. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, has also pledged to enforce federal immigration law through the Justice Department. Early efforts to place a temporary ban on travelers from certain Middle Eastern countries and on all political refugees have been held up in the courts. Stay tuned. The struggle continues.